Am I the asshole for not disclosing my high salary to my roommate, even though I know he's been struggling to pay rent? I'm a 28-year-old woman sharing a two-bedroom apartment with three other roommates. The space is tight, and sometimes it feels like we're practically living on top of one another. There's hardly enough room for everyone's belongings, and privacy is almost non-existent. Despite that, we managed to get by since we're all pretty easygoing. When we first moved in together, we were all in grad school and just needed somewhere affordable. So none of us had any complaints about the arrangement. We've been evenly splitting rent for 6 years now, and it's gone pretty smoothly overall. Even after my roommates graduated and began working full-time, we continued dividing rent, utilities, and groceries equally. It seemed like the fair and logical choice to me. Although they had regular jobs, I was still working through my residency with extremely long, grueling hours that left me exhausted both mentally and physically. Some weeks I worked over 80 hours at the hospital and had to catch sleep whenever and wherever possible, even napping in my car during quick breaks. When I got home, I was usually so tired I felt like a zombie, with hardly any energy left for even basic conversation, let alone reconsidering how we split the rent. I was just focused on getting through each day. Most nights, I'd drag myself to my room, though calling it a room might be a stretch. It's a small, low-ceilinged space near the attic storage, closer to a large closet or unfinished office than a real bedroom. I didn't put much effort into decorating since there wasn't much space for anything beyond my bed, a dresser, and a small desk for my textbooks. Privacy was minimal, as I didn't even have a real door, just a flimsy curtain to separate my area from the rest of the apartment. But for me, it was enough. I've always been a reserved, introverted person, so the setup worked for me, especially since I needed solitude to recharge after long, exhausting hours at the hospital. I appreciated that my roommates respected my space, even though it wasn't perfect. When I eventually completed my residency and became a licensed emergency physician, none of my roommates even noticed. I wasn't surprised. They hardly saw me, and I'm not one to make a big announcement about things. Residency had completely drained me, and I just wanted to move quietly into the next stage of my career. Once I was officially licensed, I started working as a full-time attending physician at the same hospital, where I'd already spent years, first as an EMP during college, and then throughout my residency. The hospital felt like a second home, so taking on a physician role there felt completely natural. The pay bump was a big relief, but it wasn't a life changer right away. I still had a massive amount of student loans from med school hanging over me, constantly reminding me of all the financial sacrifices I'd made. It was great to finally earn a decent salary, but I still had a lot to do before I could feel financially comfortable. So I continued with our usual rent split without even thinking about it. I'd been living with these roommates for 6 years, and our arrangement had always worked well. Besides, it was practical. I didn't have a partner or kids and didn't feel the need to move into a fancy, overpriced place just because I could afford it. Honestly, I didn't feel like I owed them anything extra just because I was now earning more. We all moved into this apartment with the same understanding, and I felt our arrangement was fair. Splitting everything evenly meant nobody had to stress over who paid more or who was in debt to whom. This setup was straightforward and uncomplicated, and after all the stress of med school, that kind of simplicity was something I truly valued. I wanted things to stay as they were, and I assumed my roommates would feel the same way. My 27-year-old roommate Jake, who has always been open about his financial struggles, ended up in a car accident yesterday. Being the youngest among us, he probably has the hardest time managing money out of all the roommates. When I saw his name appear on the patient list during my shift, I felt a wave of dread, unsure of what to expect, but bracing myself as I walked into the exam area where he'd been brought by ambulance. Relief washed over me once I realized his injuries weren't as bad as I'd feared. He had whiplash, which I knew would be painful but manageable with time, and a deep cut on his arm from broken glass that was bleeding heavily, requiring a few stitches. But in the grand scheme of things, he'd be okay. Knowing it could have been much worse, I put on a professional face and focused on his care. As soon as he saw me in my scrubs, I could see something register. He noticed I was working as an attending doctor, not a resident or intern. It must have clicked that I'd moved past the training phase of my career. Until then, I hadn't thought my transition from resident to attending physician was worth mentioning at home. It didn't seem important, We didn't really discuss our careers in depth. I'd go to work, come home. That was pretty much the extent of our interactions, and it seemed fine for all of us. But as I cared for him, I could tell he was piecing things together. While he didn't know my exact salary, he understood that an attending physician earns significantly more than a resident. I figured it wouldn't take him long to look up an estimate of my salary increase since getting licensed, probably realizing that I made at least double what he and our other two roommates made combined. At the time, I brushed it off, focusing on my shift and feeling relieved he'd be okay. I figured it was just a quick interaction with a familiar face during my shift and assumed he'd go home, rest up, and move on. I didn't realize how much it had impacted him. Later, I found out he left the hospital feeling hurt, maybe even betrayed. When I finally got home, exhausted after a long shift, I walked into the apartment and saw all three of them waiting for me in the living room. It was an odd atmosphere, almost like an intervention. They sat there, arms crossed, with unreadable expressions. Drained from being up for over 24 hours, I barely had the energy to process it. But as soon as I put my bag down, Jake demanded to know my salary, his intensity, catching me completely off guard. I didn't expect him to even care, much less confront me. Exhausted and unprepared for an evasive answer, I just told them the truth. Being upfront felt like the right choice in my exhausted state. I didn't have the energy to lie or sugarcoat. I thought honesty might diffuse the situation, but instead, shock spread across their faces as if I'd confessed to some huge wrongdoing. That turned out to be a mistake. They reacted immediately, launching into emotional speeches about Jake's struggles to cover rent each month, scraping by paycheck to paycheck. His anger was obvious as his voice grew louder, and I realized he'd been holding onto these feelings for a while. As he continued, his complaints went beyond just rent. He brought up everything from groceries to utilities and even minor household costs. He made it clear he was frustrated, saying he'd been scraping by while I, in his words, was hoarding my money on a physician's salary. He talked about having to skip meals or rely on cheap, barely nutritious food just to make it to the next paycheck. Hearing all of this was difficult, especially since I hadn't known the extent of his struggles, and I felt caught off guard. I hadn't deliberately kept my salary a secret. I simply hadn't thought it was relevant. But as he kept talking, I could feel myself tensing up. He said he felt like I'd taken advantage of the situation, making him struggle while I supposedly lived comfortably. Then the other two roommates, Tara, Jake's girlfriend, and Alex joined in, and it became overwhelming. They shared how they felt blindsided and hurt, that I hadn't offered to contribute more now that I earned significantly more. While they weren't as openly angry as Jake was, their disappointment was evident, and it stung. They expressed feelings of betrayal, like I'd been keeping a secret that affected everyone. Tara mentioned giving up social outings and things she enjoyed because she couldn't justify the expense while I was supposedly sitting pretty. It seemed like they'd already discussed this amongst themselves before I got home, as their words felt prepared, almost rehearsed, like they'd been waiting to confront me all day. They said it felt unfair and one-sided now that they knew my financial situation, and that keeping our split the same when I could afford more seemed selfish, even intentionally deceptive. Their voices grew louder, overlapping, their frustration palpable. I just stood there, listening, feeling overwhelmed. Keeping a neutral face under pressure is something I'm trained to do, so I just stood quietly, absorbing it all without letting my exhaustion show. At that point, I was beyond drained. After a day of managing crises and giving my all to help others, I came home expecting peace, only to face this confrontation in what should have been my sanctuary. I kept my composure, holding my expression neutral and my voice steady, though a hollow anger was building inside me. Once they'd finished, I finally responded calmly but directly. I explained that I still had med school loans, a huge debt I was working to manage, and that I was in the process of building financial stability after years of grinding through residency. I shared that I wasn't in some ideal financial situation. I was just beginning to make headway towards stability. I know my response was blunt, maybe even came across as cold, but I was completely exhausted. I didn't have the energy to soften my words. When I finished, I looked at their faces, feeling a new distance between us that I hadn't seen coming. Without adding anything more, I turned and went to bed, ignoring their continued remarks. I barely made it to my room before collapsing, weighed down by exhaustion and the sudden strain in my living situation. I thought they'd cool down overnight and that we could discuss things calmly in the morning. But when I woke up, the atmosphere was icy. All three of them were giving me the silent treatment, making it clear they weren't ready to let this go. It felt like the air had grown heavy with tension and disappointment. They barely acknowledged me, and when they did, it was with judgmental, hurt expressions, as though I'd crossed some unspoken line. After sharing this space for 6 years, everything suddenly felt different, like I was a stranger in my own home. Moving through the apartment, I felt the weight of their silence pressing down. Their presence was louder than words, and each glance they threw my way was full of quiet resentment, cutting deeper than any argument could. It was painfully clear they weren't planning to let it go. They wanted another conversation, and I could feel it simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt again. I knew they were going to ask me to either pay more rent or help cover Jake's share. Part of me wondered if they had a point. Maybe I'd been too absorbed in my own issues to notice theirs. Should I have offered to help sooner? The thing is, I liked the arrangement we had. I enjoyed the simplicity of living frugally while I sorted out my finances. I didn't want things to change, especially since I felt I was finally gaining some control over my own situation. But now, seeing how upset they all were, I couldn't ignore the guilt creeping in. I'd thought we were all on the same page and comfortable with the way things were. Now, I was seeing it all from a new perspective. Had I missed something important? Had I been selfish, focusing only on myself while they struggled? I didn't want to mess up the home and balance we'd built together over the years. Our arrangement had worked for so long, and I'd been content with it. But now, I felt like I was being cornered, guilt-tripped into paying more just because my financial situation had changed. Update. First of all, thank you all for your advice, support, and well wishes. I was truly overwhelmed by the responses, and I read through every single comment. It was heartening to see so many people taking the time to help me work through this, so I wanted to answer some common questions and give an update. To clarify our living situation, I left out a few details that might help explain things. Our apartment is technically a 2-bedroom, but it's not as straightforward as it sounds. There's one master bedroom that's quite large with its own bathroom, which Jake and Tara share. Then there's a smaller bedroom that our 4th roommate, Alex, occupies. My room isn't actually a bedroom. It's a converted area off the attic storage. It's about the same size as Alex's room, but with a low, slanted ceiling, no closet, and only a curtain for a door. I've always liked my space and didn't mind its quirks. It's quiet and tucked away, and I'd come to accept it as part of our setup over the years. As for why I told them my salary, honestly, I was caught off guard and exhausted after a long shift when I walked in that night to find them all waiting for me. I wasn't ready to handle the conversation delicately. Jake had clearly done some research after seeing me at the hospital, and his guesses were pretty close. Rather than dodge the question or give them a vague answer, I just confirmed it. I didn't give an exact figure, but he already had a rough idea, and in that moment, I simply didn't have the energy to be evasive. Why did he look it up? Your guess is as good as mine. Sitting around in triage, probably bored, frustrated, and with nothing else to do but scroll his phone, he likely found it shocking to see me in a doctor's role, especially since none of them even realized I'd completed my residency. After the blow-up, I decided to have a one-on-one talk with Alex, our 4th roommate, who had been the least vocal during the confrontation. I hoped he could provide a more balanced perspective. Alex is still in grad school in his mid-20s, and I've always considered him the most level-headed of the group. When we spoke, he calmly explained the situation from their viewpoint, and it helped me understand the root of their anger. It turns out Jake's frustration went beyond just my salary. After the accident, he was angry about his wrecked car and the medical bills he'd now have to pay, but he also felt genuinely blindsided by my income. He'd assumed I was in a similar financial situation to theirs and felt like I'd been deceptive by staying quiet about it. Apparently, he and Tara had talked about it extensively before I got home, and she was frustrated because she'd been covering part of his rent during the months he was between jobs. I hadn't known she was helping him financially. I kept to myself and didn't pry into their lives, so I didn't realize he was struggling that much. Apparently, she was convinced I should have been contributing more from the start and encouraged him to confront me. Together, they went to Alex and laid out their perspective before I got home, painting a picture of me as someone freeloading by not pitching in more, despite my salary. They felt so justified that they set up the whole intervention, convinced they had every right to confront me as a group. Alex also mentioned that one of their main complaints was that I didn't participate in household duties like they did. I buy my own groceries, cook for myself, and keep my space clean. I hadn't joined in on their shared cooking or cleaning, not out of a sense of superiority, but simply because it was what I was used to. With residency and my irregular shifts, I was rarely around at normal mealtimes, and I didn't want to rely on them for food or chores when I couldn't contribute in the same way. To me, it always seemed easier to handle my own meals and cleaning, especially since I wasn't adding much to the common spaces. However, they saw this as me being disconnected from them and from the shared responsibilities in the apartment. But then, something struck me. They told me they felt I didn't need the apartment as much as others might. Our place had always been passed down from one student to another, with people moving out by choice and new tenants coming in through mutual connections. I reminded Alex that we hadn't chosen this apartment based on financial need. It was just a convenient, affordable setup we'd all come across through friends. Financial need was never a part of our discussions when we moved in or set up the rent split. Alex then asked me why I hadn't considered moving out on my own, given my income. I explained that while I was indeed earning more than them, I still had a huge amount of medical school debt to pay off. My net worth was probably still in the negative because of those loans, and living frugally was finally helping me make progress in reducing that debt. I also clarified that despite stereotypes about doctor salaries, not all physicians are wealthy. Many of us spend years digging ourselves out of debt before reaching any real stability. Alex seemed surprised by this. He hadn't fully understood my financial situation and had assumed I was financially comfortable because he knew I had an undergraduate scholarship. I explained that my athletic scholarship only covered my first year, so it was limited, and I'd accumulated significant debt through medical school and beyond. After talking with Alex, I realized it was time to move on. Their perception of my financial situation had fundamentally shifted the dynamic, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that no matter what I did, their view of me wasn't going to change. The lingering resentment about my income would probably keep resurfacing, and I didn't want to feel constantly scrutinized, having to defend my choices or be pressured to contribute more just because of my paycheck. This morning, I made a decision. I told Jake, Tara, and Alex that I'd be staying until the end of the lease and then moving out. I said they could start looking for someone else to fill my room, and I wished them well in advance. For the first time since this all started, the tension eased a little. I think they were relieved to hear I'd made a decision, and they accepted it without further argument. It felt like we'd reached a sense of closure. Now, I'm focusing on the next chapter. I've started looking at studio apartments nearby, and I'm even considering putting a down payment on a house. Although I'd clung to the familiarity of our arrangement, I'm beginning to see this as the push I needed to step out of my comfort zone. I'd always told myself I liked the simplicity of our setup, that I didn't need my own space. But now I'm starting to realize that maybe it's time to build a life that reflects where I am now, rather than where I was. As frustrating as this situation has been, it's also given me a chance to reflect on what I want. Moving out feels like the best decision, for my peace of mind and for them to live with someone whose needs align more closely with theirs. I'm grateful to everyone here who helped me see this clearly. Here's to new beginnings and to moving forward, no matter how unexpectedly it comes about. Thank you all again for your kind words, advice, and encouragement. This experience has been a valuable lesson, and I feel ready to embrace what comes next. Commentary time! This story is an insightful look into how evolving circumstances can impact long-standing arrangements among friends. Initially, OP's roommate setup worked because they were all financially aligned, living simply and equally sharing expenses. Yet as OP's career and income grew, it unintentionally created a divide that was only revealed when one roommate stumbled upon the truth. For Jake, seeing OP's success sparked both surprise and resentment, which highlights an interesting social dynamic. When friends or roommates experience a significant income change, it can create feelings of envy or even expectations for financial support, even if that's never been discussed. OP handled the confrontation with admirable composure, maintaining transparency about their financial priorities, including the reality of medical school debt, a common but often overlooked burden for many young professionals. By standing firm in their decision to continue with the equal rent split, OP showed that they were simply trying to secure their own stability, not to flaunt their income. The ultimate decision to move out was a wise one. It allowed OP to avoid future resentment and guilt tripping from roommates, creating a clear boundary between their professional and personal life. Moving forward, OP's story is a powerful reminder that financial independence and boundaries are essential for sustaining relationships and that sometimes growing apart is a necessary step toward personal growth. Have you ever faced challenges with friends or roommates due to differences in income? How did you navigate it? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if you found this story insightful, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories about balancing friendships, boundaries, and life transitions. Let's keep this conversation going and support each other in finding solutions to similar challenges.